Hi, folks. Here with another one off live. A very different one off live than a lot of the one off lives on this channel. I'm, of course, near my award. I got it from a magazine article about Hawaiian Islands. So a little different here. Not sitting special live. And it's a different live than most of the videos that you're going to see on this channel because the title is kind of arresting. Why William Shakespeare couldn't have been a writer, right? Now, you're probably wondering, why am I talking about this on a channel that's about writing and writers? On the one hand, it seems appropriate. On the other hand, it doesn't. So let me just explain. I happen to be one of those individuals who happens to believe that William Shakespeare couldn't have written the plays that were attributed to him. Now, I've had this position for quite a number of years. So it's nothing new to me. I didn't just come to it overnight. I didn't just watch a YouTube video. In fact, the reason that I came to this conclusion came from reading the works of Shakespeare. I happen to have a complete works myself, and it came from reading, I believe it was Henry V, and the French in Henry V. And it was reading the French in Henry V that made me think, how could this so-called country bumpkin, that's kind of a pejorative term, but how could this guy from a rural town in the English countryside, Stratford upon Avon, how could this guy, whom we don't know much about, produce a play like Henry V? After all, Henry V was about king, royalty. How does a commoner produce a play like this? A commoner writing about royalty would be one thing, but a commoner writing about royalty and aristocrats with such intimacy, with such knowledge, that seems rather a tall order. How could this person write this play? How could this person have produced these works? Well, that was what eventually led me to, I guess, what is normally called the Shakespeare authorship question, right? Sorry. Sorry for the changing camera. So it led me to what is known as the Shakespeare authorship question later on. But for me, it was my own question, which I answered by saying Shakespeare couldn't have written this works. Now, why did I take the position that William Shakespeare was not the author of the plays and sonnets attributed to him? Well, for a start, when we look at Shakespeare, who was really, in terms of his real name, Shakespeare, that's, that's the name of the man from Stratford upon Avon. When we look at Shakespeare, we really don't know much about him. The man himself is a mystery. The individual is kind of at odds with the material. And I'll give you some examples. We don't have any record of this man's education. We don't know whether he went to the local grammar school in Stratford. Now, this Shakespeare came from a family that was, of course, modest. His father was a glover. He also became a member, I believe, of the town council or some body in the town. And this would have enabled Shakespeare to go to school or go to this grammar school. But we have no records in regards to this grammar school. So we don't know whether Shakespeare actually attended this school or not. We don't know if he could have learned the lessons of the day in such grammar schools. They would have taught, to a certain extent, Latin, and they would have taught some degree of literature, to an example, besides mathematics, maybe some degree of math. But we don't really know whether Shakespeare attended this school or not, or for that matter, attended any school. Now, when he became an adult, we are aware that Shakespeare did not go to any of the what are now called ancient universities in the UK, Oxford and Cambridge. There are no records of Shakespeare attending Oxford or Cambridge that we're aware of. And by Shakespeare, of course, we mean Shakespeare, William Shakespeare. So, right off the bat, we don't have any knowledge of his education. And in order for these plays to be written by an individual, that individual had to be an educated person. He had to have more than just a modicum of knowledge about how to write and how to read. He had to have an advanced ability to read and very above par writing skills. We see it in the plays. Now, speaking of the plays, let's turn to the plays themselves. The plays themselves contain such bodies of knowledge, such depth of learning, that the person who wrote these plays clearly had to have read a great number of works. In fact, he had to have read a number of works that probably were not even translated into English. Again, we're talking about an era where there were no lending libraries per se. There were bookshops in places like London, bookstores in London, but there were no libraries per se, except at a place like Oxford or Cambridge. And unless you were a student or a scholar or professor there, you wouldn't have been able to get access to the libraries in Oxford or Cambridge. So it's not like there were a lot of opportunities for someone who was, to use the term, commoner, meaning someone who was not nobility, someone who was not an aristocrat, to be educated, or at least have a degree of autodidactic learning in the way that people can today. Today, because of innovations like this, like YouTube or other aspects of the internet, people can watch videos here on YouTube. People can read articles on the internet and even read books for that matter. They can learn and teach themselves. That ability would have been very minor for an individual back over 400 to 500 years ago in England. And remember that England was not a society that was in any way, shape, or form an equal society. It still isn't to this day. But it wasn't a society where individuals at least had even a modicum of education, had even basic education. It was a society in which there were and still are huge class differences between the aristocrats and commoners, between the wealthy and the poor, and between perhaps the very minor middle class and the very large working class. Most people were not literate. Most people were not educated, even in terms of basic schooling. And even most people, and certainly most people, did not go on to colleges or universities. That simply wasn't the case. So we look at this man and we go, okay, no record of his education as a child, or in the town that he was in. We obviously know that he obviously did not attend Oxford or Cambridge, so he didn't get a university of education. But the plays have a body of knowledge in areas such as a knowledge of law, a knowledge of, for example, to some extent, falconry, um, some maybe minor aspects of science, medicine to a certain extent, various subjects, especially in terms of the law. The plays don't simply trot out some modest amount of information regards to law. No, whoever wrote this play, or the plays attributed to Shakespeare or Shakespeare, clearly was either trained in the law, perhaps through the Inns of Court, which were the lawyer training schools of the day, or received enough training and information, enough learning, so they were very conversant with the law. Now, how could a guy from this small, modest provincial town have access to training in the law like that? Have a body of knowledge or corpus of law? Very unlikely. And a lot of the other information, probably unlikely as well. And then finally, we have what eventually happened to Shakespeare. Shakespeare wound up a merchant. He wound up a businessman. Now, Shakespeare was also, which is why he moved to London, an actor and supposedly a theater manager. But he wound up a businessman. He wound up owning several homes in Stratford, which he went back to. And he ended up hoarding grains and being rather miserly and tight-fisted with money. Does this square with the image, not the image per se, but does this square with the kind of man that we assume wrote the plays? Wrote plays like Othello, which has a degree of tolerance. Wrote plays like The Merchant of Venice, also writing with a degree of tolerance about its characters. Even some of the plays are even set, speaking of Merchant of Venice, some of the plays are even set in Italy. To our knowledge, Shakespeare didn't leave England, from what we know of the man. Shakespeare, of course. He didn't leave England, to our knowledge. So, if Shakespeare didn't leave England, how did he attain this very intimate and extremely well-rounded knowledge of Italy? Because again, the person who wrote these plays clearly had a great deal of detailed knowledge about Italy, as if they had been there. In the final analysis, it makes sense that Shakespeare wasn't the writer of the plays and the sonnets and poems attributed to him. Just look at his will. Several shaky signatures and a second best bed left to his wife. No books. So we're to believe that this writer, this great playwright, supposedly one of the greatest playwrights and writers in global history, not just English, not just the UK, but in global history, had no books to pass on to his family, no papers, no manuscripts, nothing but a second best bed to his wife, and a few other aspects of his estate. Hard to believe. At the end of the day, the logical choice is not Shakespeare. And on that note, I bid you adieu. Thanks for watching. Bye, folks.